I was actually involved in a meeting that the UN organized back in 2004, just by coincidence, really. And it was the first time that investors were brought together to discuss this idea of incorporating environmental and social factors into investment analysis. We didn't know this term ESG, it came later, right? And the concept is really very simple. It's before you make an investment, most investors do a certain amount of analysis. You know, they review the financial statements, they review the management, they look at the competition, and they look at forecasts. And the concept of ESG is simply saying, in addition to doing all of that work, you should also consider factors that are environmental, social, or governance. You should add that to your investment analysis. Why? Because if you do that, you'll be a better investor. It'll make you a smarter investor. And because it will focus capital on companies that are, positively affecting the environment or social factors. So the concept is quite simple, and it's now become quite controversial. And my take on that, we can dig into that more deeply if you'd like to a little bit later, Jack, if you want to hear from the others, is that most of the people who are criticizing ESG fundamentally misunderstand what it is. I think there's really a pretty severe misunderstanding, and perhaps some of that misunderstanding is on purpose because it gets good headlines.
I think we're taking very seriously on ESG analysis, but not only treat that as additional due diligence work we need to do, right? We do not only require our portfolio to be ESG positive. I think we actually take ESG as a very important investment thesis or investment opportunity. So if you really look at our focus area today, the green tech space is the number one focus, and also the food security, a little bit healthcare. That's really sort of our focus areas, and that's green energy, clean tech space is definitely very important for climate change. So to me today, because of the technology development in the last 2 to 4 years, seems like electric vehicles, batteries, hydrogen, energy storage, the solars, and I think the green energy, clean tech today, the whole sector represents a very attractive investment target areas.
So ESG also includes kind of impact, but if you really want to start splitting these things, impact is actually even a higher level of what I will call within that ESG kind of space. And I think, and I mentioned that because not all impact investment, all impact investment would usually have a good ESG angle to it, but not all ESG investments would have a good impact angle to it, right? So it's not a perfect match from that perspective. So I think what Bruce was mentioning in the PRI, the UN got together in like the mid, I would say 2000s, and kind of came up with the UN PRI. That kind of gave rise to the rationale for having principles of responsible investments and setting up kind of what is now kind of the ESG framework.
What are some of the most important climate-related ESG risks that investors should be thinking about?
But in fact, it's what we call the transition risks that for businesses are more serious. So what's a transition risk? Well, there are many different types. The first is policy. So as governments slowly take action on climate change, they are passing policies and will pass more policies, and policy affects business in many ways. And some of those policies may be positively affect business if you're in a certain industry, or negatively in others. Here in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act is an enormous piece of policy that really affects a lot of businesses. The second one is, to me, the biggest transition risk is innovation, particularly technology innovation. So climate change is spurring a lot of companies to come up with new products and new ways of doing business. Lane spoke to some of them as companies that he's invested in. And for businesses, this can create a tremendous risk. And then the third transition risk is around consumers, consumer behavior, social norms.
Yes, the data part is really difficult. So taking a step back, so AIB, like other MDBs, we have built probably, I would say, 50 to 70 years of history on working with companies and a group of institutions in the developing kind of projects or developing developmental impact kind of investments. So what that allows us to do is have a bilateral relationship with them. So if we have an issue, for example, with the environment or with the social, then we will stop giving them money, right? And if you move to the capital markets world, where you have to rely on public data, and when you're buying secondary markets, you can't ask the issuers directly because, you know, they're not really going to tell you, right? Then you're forced to rely on these data aggregators and data collectors.
In terms of raising awareness and capacity building, you know, whether we're a student, we're working at a company, or we're leaders at a firm, what do you think could and should be done? And maybe even what kind of training might be available at Columbia?
So at Columbia University, what are we doing about this? On the climate side, we started a new school, the climate school, to focus exclusively on this. I'm also affiliated with the climate school in addition to the business school, though my home office is the business school. And, you know, this is sending a signal to students and those outside of the university about the importance. This is the first new school, I think, in about 40 or 50 years at Columbia. So it's a pretty big deal. We don't start a lot of schools. Within the business school, the relatively new dean, Dean McGlaris, and I have been working for the last 2 years, looking at the business school program and how do we prepare our students for these changes that are coming, particularly with respect to climate. And as of this fall, the core courses, which anybody who's been at Columbia Business School, you have to take the core. You have no choice about that. The majority of our core courses now have cases and lessons on climate change in the core. So every student has exposure to this. And now within the electives, we went from 2 electives on climate change topics to 5 this year. And next year we'll have 8 electives, which is a lot. That's an enormous amount of training. And the last thing I would say is it's a little bit like, frankly, what's happened the last 30 years with technology. You know, when I graduated from business school, this is 3 decades ago. The big thing that came at that time and has been for 30 years now is how technology, especially digital technology, has affected every business, right? If you're in business or you're in investments, you need to be aware of how technology affects your world. If you ignore it, you know, you're not going to be very successful. Okay, that was the last 30 years. The next 30 years, you better be aware of climate change. And so that's what we're training our students to do.
As a business school student, you certainly have access to a lot of public information. There are many successful portfolios, public companies in the sectors, guys like Tesla, BYD. You know, there are a lot of companies in that EV supply chain, battery supply chain, and all the leaders. I mean, taking hydrogen as an example, is a great area over time. Great investment area, you know, over time. Is the cleanest energy. So taking some of those areas as a focus area for yourself, try to get as much information as possible and try to learn about it and try to really find the smartest people in the world and talk to them, learn from them. And I do think there are many things, many opportunities in that space. So you just need to be more proactive and try to really sort of you know, try to learn more, get yourself better prepared for the future.